Hello and welcome wherever you are tuning in around the world to the Open Minds podcast. The podcast that talks to inspirational people who not only exemplify having an open mind, but who are doing their bit to make the world around them a better place through the value that they bring and the work that they're doing. Today's guest is no exception to that. I'm absolutely thrilled to have Mr. Tony Wilson on board, but before we formally introduce him, I'm just going to let you know a little bit about Tony's journey to date. So Tony studied a Bachelor of Social Science, majoring in physiology, and completed his MBA before going on to be a performance coach for some of the most elite athletes around the world, in addition to some of the most renowned sporting teams across the US and here in Australia. So, for instance, he's worked with UCLA, and here in our home state of Queensland, he's worked with the Queensland Reds, Queensland Bulls, and the Brisbane Broncos, having seen some great success stories within his tenure. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here, listeners, and I would say Tony was struck by a little bit of curiosity. I'm going to ask him about this in a moment, because he then made the transition to the corporate world. And I dare say that curiosity may have been sparked by the thought of, how can I take these skills and this, performance science knowledge and take that into the workplace. And subsequently, he founded the Performance Lab in 2017, of which now he's the director and head coach in. And he is working with some of the most renowned CEOs and leaders around the world and big companies and multinationals to bring out the absolute best in their teams. And if that isn't enough, he's also a renowned motivational speaker and keynote speaker. So it's with great gratitude and great pleasure. Tony Wilson, welcome to Open Minds.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate you having me on, mate.
Absolute pleasure, Tony. Tony, first question, how did I go with that intro around that curiosity set piece? Because I'm curious myself, what was the catalyst from you to really, helping people on the sporting field to helping people in the boardroom?
Yeah, unfortunately, it wasn't quite as noble as you made it out, mate. What happened is I was working with sporting teams, and I got to do a lot of really great things relatively young,
Right.
And I don't know if you know how sporting teams work, but you essentially have a big review every single year. It doesn't matter if you win the title or if you come last, there'll always be a review. And sporting teams are really notorious for this kind of process where if the head coach gets sacked, then the new coach will bring all of their own performance staff with them.
Right.
Now, I'd worked sort of at different places, kind of all around Australia, and I was at the point where I didn't want to move around anymore, and I sat in this final review that I was doing at one of the sporting teams I was working with. And I just had this moment where I thought, I don't know if I want to do this anymore. I don't know if I want to be subject to this review every year, not knowing if I have a job next year or whatever. And in Australia, there's not a lot of professional sporting teams compared to the US. So if I wanted to stay in Brisbane, there's really only 4 jobs I could have. 3 of them I have had already. And there's a saying about coaches, and that is that there's 2 types of coaches. There's coaches that have been fired and coaches that are going to be fired, right? And so being that as it is, every position is so tenuous within sport. And so I knew I wanted to transition out, but I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. And so I went back to uni and did an MBA at that point, just knowing it would be a platform for me to do something else. And I wasn't sure what that was. And then I completely lucked into this situation where one of the sponsors of one of the teams I was working with asked me to come and work with their leadership group to help talk to them about how do they create team culture. And I finished doing that. It was like a series of workshops that I did with this team, and it turned out that was a thing people did for a living, and I didn't even know it existed, and it just became the perfect sort of segue. When you're thinking of a career change, I think the biggest thing you want to understand is, how do I take this 10 years of experience that I have and parlay it into something else, as opposed to thinking, I've got to start afresh. And that was just a perfect segue for me to be able to do that. And then as I get deeper, one of the things I realized was you know, for being from a performance science background, we sort of question everything we do, right? But in that leadership and performance space within a lot of organizations at that point, there was barely any science attached to it. It was really anecdotal. It was really, you know, oh, we've seen people do this. That seems to work, so why don't we do it, without any rigor around it? And one of the things that I took from sport is that, you know, working with one team, we might go and see a completely different team train in a different sport just to pick up, you know, ideas for training and development for our players.
Right.
But we'd always go back as a support staff and say, okay, would we do this thing? Would that work? And we'd really break it down as to why it should work or shouldn't from a scientific point of view, and then we'd implement it. And I just realized that there was a lot of scope within the corporate world to be able to apply some of that.
Right. Amazing. I mean, just hearing you talk, the overlap just really sort of comes out, you know, around this performance team culture, and that's absolutely amazing. Tony, you also mentioned there, as a young fella, you did a lot of sports yourself, and that was going to be my next question around. I really want to get back to the grassroots level, and I was wondering if you could just let the listeners know a little bit more about your upbringing, and specifically if there were any memorable experiences that really inspired you to take this career path.
Yeah. Do you know, it's funny how everything seems to, when you're making decisions at the time, they seem in the moment, but it's only upon reflection that you realize how you ended up where you are.
Yeah.
I grew up in Queensland in a what was then a small coastal town called Caloundra, which is a lot bigger now. But when I grew up there, you know, it was a pretty small town. And when I was in grade 7 going into grade 8, which was the start of high school, I got a sporting scholarship to a private school down in Brisbane. And I was really, really fortunate that happened. Although I didn't really feel like it at the time, to move from the Sunshine Coast going surfing every day to being locked in a boarding school in Brisbane wasn't my best experience as a 12, 13-year-old. But it's one of those things that, while you don't realize it at the moment, it plays a massive role in your life. And I say that I was lucky because, number one, my parents wouldn't have been able to afford to send me to a private school like that. But number two, as I sort of went through school, I realized when I got to 15 that all of my friends that I hung out with at primary school were all now leaving school early, you know, just getting kind of menial jobs to get by. And, you know, they were all really good surfers, but that was kind of all they were doing. And it was at that point I realized I was pretty lucky to be, you know, in a different environment.
Yeah.
But one of the downsides of getting a sporting scholarship to a school, and especially at the point that I went to school, is that you're constantly worried that if you don't perform, they're going to take that scholarship away from you.
Right.
And schools would not do that today, because they'd probably end up, you know, on a current affair having to explain themselves. But back then it was a lot more cutthroat. And I had a lot of my friends that came to the school on sporting scholarships as well. They had those scholarships removed when they were 15 because they just weren't performing.
Wow.
And again, being from families that couldn't afford to send them to that school, they just had to go to a different school. They had no choice. And so I felt enormous pressure to perform really well. And, you know, lo and behold, I think a lot of that angst about being able to do that, and some of these strategies that I was able to employ, but also just that feeling of I am my performance at that point, is something that was both good and bad, but really gave me this scope of, you know, of my future self wanting to help people perform at their best as well.
Right. I think that's quite intriguing, you know, because it would have been part of your identity around this performance set piece. And if for whatever reason, like, you know, we know that injuries happen.
Yep.
And you experience that pressure yourself, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
So a big part of that was wanting to help other people experiencing.
Absolutely. And ironically, one of the big things we work with on really, really high achieving athletes is dissociating from that feeling that I am what I do, right?
Yes.
Not to mention, you know, and I work with a lot of executives on that, especially in those professions where people really connect to what they do, whether that's medical or lawyers and professional services are big ones. They really identify with who they are insofar as what they do. And being able to remove that from people now is really important. A lot of people think that's a bit counterintuitive in a way. They think that you need to identify that strongly with being a winner or being an athlete or whatever it is. But interestingly, by taking some of that pressure off, it actually allows you to perform better.
Yeah. You know, immediately some young tennis players come to mind, you know, where there's so much emphasis on, I guess, you know, the cameras being on them and them having to live up to certain expectations. What is that specifically, Tony? Would you say it's identification with the ego that they get attached to? And how would you go about, what are some of the perhaps modalities you'd use to separate that? Because I can see
Yeah.
its importance. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. So a lot of it actually comes from when you're young. So
Mm.
most people, and this is especially true of kids that are good at sport young, that have parents that weren't necessarily good at sport or don't understand the sporting environment very well.
Mhm.
Because what happens is you start winning and people start liking you because you're winning, right? And so that then becomes part of your identity and part of the value that you have about yourself, because that's the value that other people place on you.
Mm.
And I see this all the time. Parents inadvertently, they're trying to do the right thing, but they'll inadvertently do things like they won't put their kids in positions where they are not going to win,
Yeah.
because they don't want to ruin their confidence or something like that. But it just reinforces to the athlete, if you can't win, then that's actually a worthless endeavor. So
Yeah.
therefore, I would be worthless if I didn't win. Do you know what I mean? And that kind of escalates sort of through your life. And
Mm.
what we try to do now is we do a couple of exercises, and I think this is good for just about anyone to do. If you're a leader, if you're a high level exec, is to think, okay, number one, who am I in different areas of my life? So not just as an athlete, who am I as a father, a son, a husband, mother, daughter, whatever that looks like. Who am I currently, and then who do I want to be? And it's interesting that sometimes when we get caught up in one thing, we get really invested in one thing, whether that's our career or our sport,
Mm.
we take a look at who we want to be in the other areas. And sometimes it actually, if we're honest, it's not matching up. Do you know what I mean? So if I say, I want to be a fantastic father, but I'm investing all of my energy into work, then chances are I'm not living up to that. So it gives us an opportunity to stop and think about those things, and then think about the things that we might do
Mhm.
if we were to change that story. The second thing is we talk about what legacy you want to leave.
Right.
And when we start to think about that, we start thinking about things other than winning or making money and those sorts of things.
Mhm.
So a lot of things athletes will say is, number one, they go really long term. I want to be known as, one of the best ever in this event, or up there with these other people that are legends. But I
Mm.
also want to give back to the sport. You know what I mean? I want to help sort of
Yeah.
develop younger children and younger athletes and that sort of
Mm.
thing. And
Mm.
it then gives them sort of a bigger purpose, and it gives them more than one yardstick to measure themselves on.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, you can either have like a terrible performance at a meet, but if we really reflect on that, is that going to impact what you want to perform, what you want to achieve long term? Probably not. Is that going to impact these other social things that you want to do? Probably not.
Yeah.
So then all of a sudden it takes the pressure off that. And we call this in performance, we call this broad focus, narrow focus, right? So
Yeah.
going really broad. So
Yeah.
sometimes you can say, is this thing as important as I think it is?
Mm.
Versus going really narrow sometimes, which in training might be, okay, how do I get the most out of this specific training session? And being able to switch that focus a lot is really important.
Yeah. I found it interesting, Tony. You mentioned earlier on there around the fact that a lot of these limiting beliefs start off as children, things they inherit from their parents, and their attachment to failure. Starts from a very very early age. So what I'm hearing is you're really instrumental in helping people shift perspectives, shift beliefs, and taking a bit more of a bird's eye perspective of their legacy and what value they have to bring, which is absolutely amazing. And unbeknown to the listeners, we had a brief chat prior to hitting the record button about parenting. Tony and I are both fathers of three children, and we're just talking about the challenges that come along with technology. For instance, and I wanted to ask you around that technology set piece, Tony. Um, in your years as a performance coach working with athletes, you would have seen this proliferation, right, of sports analytics and technology take place. And I'm curious around the fact, in your opinion, have you seen that facilitate greater performance, or do the fundamentals, some of the ones you just mentioned, do they stay the same?
I think the fundamentals stay the same, and the biggest thing we have to be aware of in all data measurement technology, whether we talk about just the basic technology that we use every day, or the more targeted sort of biometric biofeedback, that self-quantification technology.
Yes.
I think you have to always remember that part of it is science and part of it is still art, right?
Yeah.
I read a really brilliant paper the other day where they took two sets of athletes, runners, and they tracked their recovery every day. So the recovery was their resting heart rate, what we call our heart rate variability,
Yes.
and then just some subjective things as well.
Hmm.
And so every morning you would wake up and you would get a score that would be red, yellow, or green. Green is your physiology is brilliant, you are ready to go. Yellow's, you're so-so, and red's like, warning signs.
Yep.
And so they had two groups, and one group did not look at that at all, and they just stuck to a standard 6-month training program to run a marathon. Okay. The other group paid attention to that, and every morning they'd wake up and they'd check whether they were red, yellow, or green, and they'd have different training sessions based on that. So green would be the training session you were going to do anyway, that's part of the same program that the other people did. A yellow would be slightly reduced, and red would be slightly reduced again.
Mm-hmm.
So what they found, and I thought this was incredible, over this 6-month period, the people that adjusted their training based on their physiology, they ran more PBs, they were less injured, and they actually did less training, less total volume of training than the others, and had better results. Now, that's a purely scientific approach, which worked really well. But if we take that and we start looking at, things that aren't as controlled, right? So from a sporting point of view, this would be, okay, I wake up and I don't feel great, but there's this really key session that I could do. And if I push through it, that's really good for me developing my grit. And also I have a rest day after that. So maybe it doesn't matter so much.
Right.
So we've got a lot of those things to take into consideration. And it's an interesting conversation, because I was listening to a futurist the other day saying it's going to get to the point where our millennial graduate lawyer is going to walk into a meeting with a law firm partner, and they're going to be checking their heart rate. And if that conversation becomes too stressful for them, they're going to say, oh, look, my heart rate's up now. I can't engage in this conversation anymore. I'm going to have to leave, right? And I thought that was really funny. But what people haven't thought of, and this is the art part, is if that's what we're going to do, then we also need to understand the opposite side of that, which is if I walk into that partner meeting and that partner says, I'm going to give you a $20,000 bonus, and it sends my heart rate up, then I should probably go, oh, hang on, that's probably too much money. How about 10,000? No, that's still too much. 5, okay, 5 is the right heart rate for me, so I'll just take 5,000 instead of 20,000, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's a good example of, that science versus art piece of it.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. In a way, I can see the massive benefits, right, to biometrics, that sort of thing. But I think an education set piece has to also take place around emotional regulation. So we're seeing the heart rate go up, right? What are some breathing techniques I can harness right now to bring that heart rate right down and bring the logical part of my brain back online?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the biggest things that we talk about. It's the when we go into that choking zone, emotional brain fires up, but we also switch to autopilot, right? We start doing things off instinct. Yeah. And for most of us, our instinct under pressure is really bad, right? And you can think about this from the point of view of, you have a really heated argument with someone you love. Yeah. Usually you come out of that and you regret things you said or did or whatever it is. And so it's a really great example of, you just went to instinct, and instinct was actually not a good thing for you. Yeah. So I think understanding that piece is really important, but also understanding that piece insofar as, for an athlete, sometimes that autopilot is good, sometimes it's bad. Depends if we have to make decisions or not. Yeah. And we get ourselves in the most trouble when we cross those things over, when I should be doing something autopilot, but instead of now I'm overthinking it, versus I should be actually thinking about something instead of just, instead of acting on autopilot.
Yes.
So I think both of those are important, but I guess what lies under that, it's even more important, is understanding the things that drive me and the things that put me in that choking zone, right? Yeah. So if we come back to that self-quantification piece, for me, I know that I very, very easily overreach, right?
Right.
And if I am training physically for something, if someone gives me a training program to follow,
Mhm.
my flaw is I look at that training program and I'll try and do everything on it to the detriment of my own health.
Right.
And I was doing triathlons quite a few years ago now,
Yes.
and if there was something on the training program, I would fit it in. And I realized my moment of self-awareness to go, this is just like, this is a trait that can work for me or really work against me,
Mhm.
is that one morning I had to be on a 6 o'clock flight. So I had to leave home at 5 to get to the airport. But on my training program, I had something like 5 1K intervals at a certain pace. And I found myself down the road from home at 3:45 in the morning doing these intervals. And I
Oh
just
my
thought,
goodness.
well, like, this is crazy, right? So from my point of view, what's really great about that biometric tracking is I can wake up and it gives me an objective measure, right? I
Yeah.
can forget the emotional story, which says, hey, you need to do this today, and instead go, okay, the physiology says that I really shouldn't do that. Now I can make a decision based on that. And I
Yeah.
think that's probably for everything we use, right? Whether it's technology that we use for social media, it's understanding the traps that you fall into, those things that you in particular are really bad at regulating for some reason, and
Yes.
use the technology as a second opinion on that. I think that's where it becomes really helpful.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Tony, how important is mindset when it comes to performance?
So that's a really, really big topic, right? It's a really broad topic, and
Yeah.
mindset is extremely important. But I'm going to put a little caveat on this, and that's that
Mhm.
uh, one thing really great performers understand as opposed to mediocre performers is that the thing that drives all of our thoughts and feelings is actually action, right? So in a way, mindset, and there's this I'm kind of trying to explain this at two different levels. In one set, mindset shouldn't matter in a lot of ways, but in another way, the ultimate mindset is that it doesn't matter how I feel, what matters is what I do, right?
What it is,
So
yeah.
a great example of that is just to say that the average person will choose positive behaviors when they feel good. Great performers understand that choosing the positive behaviors makes them feel good,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
We don't do things that are hard because we're motivated. We often are motivated because we do things that are hard. And that's a really, really subtle shift.
Yeah.
And a great way of talking about it is, another really good exercise we do with any performers, whether we're talking about leaders or athletes, is we go through this process of just saying, okay, when you're at your absolute best,
Mhm.
how would you describe that, right? Who are you when you're at your best? And someone might say, I just did this exercise with some leaders the other day. They said, I'm confident, I'm calm, and I'm approachable. Okay.
Yeah.
Then we look at the other side. When you're at your worst, what are you doing, and how would you describe that? Oh, I'm frustrated, I'm short with people, and I'm disorganized, right? So there might be these two different personas, if you like.
Yeah.
And what's most important after that is that we really work out what are the things that I do that make me that way, right? So not only this big sort of description of who I am, but what are the things I'm doing that represent that?
How do I get there?
Yeah, which is then the key for how do I get there?
Right.
Because the funny thing about, and this sort of comes back to that performance under pressure piece as well, because often the conversation we have is, okay, if we look at when we're at our worst, when does that happen? And most people will say when I'm doubting myself, when I'm unconfident, when I'm under massive amounts of pressure.
Yeah.
And that doesn't make sense, right? Because if I break that down, I say, okay, when I'm doing really well, I do these things. But then when I'm under pressure and I need to do really well, I do these other things. And they actually don't make me successful, which
Yes.
when we break it down like that is crazy.
Mm.
And what most people don't understand is how to switch between those two. Well, number one, they never take the time to identify what those two things are. So
Yeah.
then it's harder to identify in the moment when I'm being that person.
Yeah.
But when I understand what that looks like, then my performance challenge becomes, okay, so I turn up to work and I don't feel great. I feel fatigued. I had an argument with my spouse just before I got here. Now I'm likely to go into those behaviors that make me unsuccessful. And that's a
Mm.
great example of my feelings dictate my action.
Yeah.
Whereas
Yeah.
the great performer understands that feeling follows action. So I go in, I don't feel really great. And instead of doing those things, I
Yeah.
do the things that make me really successful, which then changes how I feel. right?
Yeah.
And the broader concept there is a concept they call embodied cognition, which just says when I do positive things, I feel positive.
Right. Got you. And the reason I ask, we're hearing a lot about growth mindset, the work by Carol Dweck.
Yeah.
And particularly, the last 2.5 years, we've experienced this crazy global pandemic, and growth mindset is, all about, I guess, taking challenge and adversity as an opportunity to learn and grow. But one thing I'm curious about is, when people are feeling triggered or highly emotional, how do we, or how do you get them to have that awareness you're speaking of, in that moment to then perhaps modify their action?
Yeah. Interestingly, you just summed up what I tried to before, which is the only mindset that really matters is that growth mindset, right? That's just that I have if we break that down, I think growth mindset gets misinterpreted a lot, and it gets misinterpreted as positive thinking, which it isn't, right? Growth mindset, if we really think about it, is just my belief that I can get better at things if I apply myself to them, and then getting a reward response for that progress that I make.
Exactly.
And there's so much wrapped up in this from our previous conversation about, attaching all my worth to winning, right? My worth should actually be attached to the effort that I put in and the progress that I made, as opposed to the outcome that I got. One of the biggest rules we talk about around performance is just this rule of all that matters is what you do. Right? It doesn't matter what other people do. All that matters is what you do. It doesn't matter how you feel, which is what we just talked about. All that matters is what you do. Sometimes it doesn't matter how you think. All that matters is what you do. But this is the big one, because even the outcome doesn't matter. All that matters is what you do.
Yeah.
Right? Which is really, really hard for people to grasp.
That's right.
And I think that one in particular, that growth mindset piece, it's just so important for people to embrace, even from a mental wellness point of view, right? Because the reality is there's stuff that you're not good at. There's things that are going to go right and wrong in your day. But if you constantly have that mindset of, okay, I may not be good at that thing, but if I work at it, then I can get better.
Yeah.
One of the concepts that we talk about a lot around performance is just this concept of winners behave like winners, right? Winners just do the things that winners do. So if we break that down, we say, okay, so if you want to be better at this thing, then find someone that's better than you at it and just do what they do. Like, it literally almost comes down to that, right? And if you can execute on that, then you get better at that thing, whether that's leadership or shooting 3-pointers or swimming or whatever it is.
Yeah.
That's what it comes down to.
Yeah.
And the other thing I love about this is, I don't know if you've ever heard the concept of being anti-fragile. Have you heard?
I haven't.
Okay. So I've forgotten the author of the book, which is called Anti-Fragile, but it's such a wonderful concept. So what it says is, some things are weak, they break easily. Some things are strong, they will break eventually, but it takes a lot of effort.
Yeah.
But anti-fragile is this space where chaos makes something stronger. And I don't know what the equivalent would be. If you are into metals, maybe you could explain this to me, but it'd be like a metal. And the more you stress it, the stronger it gets.
Right.
So it's never going to break. And the only anti-fragile mindset is that growth mindset, right? It's this mindset of, I'm committed to just constant personal growth, and 2, I know that if I work at anything, I can get better at that thing. And I may not be the best in the world at it, but I can get better. And the reason that that's the only anti-fragile mindset is, if that's my mindset, whatever you say to me just feeds into that and makes it stronger. You say, Tony, you are terrible at podcasting. Like, I heard you the other day, you were absolutely horrible. I heard you speak on stage. That was the worst speech I've ever heard. If I have growth mindset and I'm committed to continual growth, instead of pushing back in that, I go, oh, come and sit here and tell me more about that, right? Because that just feeds that, right? Yeah. So it almost doesn't matter what you say to me. If I'm committed to personal growth, that just feeds into that. It gives me the opportunity to get better.
Yeah. And I would add to that, it's a different relationship that winners have to failure. It's something that doesn't shape or affect their identity or ego. It's something they actually use to fuel their drive.
Yeah, absolutely. And back to those young athletes again, the normal course for an athlete that is good when they're young, and this would be 99 times out of 100. an athlete is good when they're young because they're usually bigger and stronger and more developed than other kids. That is usually the case. And so what happens is they get praised for winning, but they don't put in as much work because they don't have to, right? They don't need to train as much because they're just bigger and stronger. And then they get to a point where other kids grow and they start beating them. And because all their self-worth is tied to winning, they back away from that. All right. Their first thought isn't, oh, I need to work harder, because they've never had to do that. Now, all of a sudden, in that growth mindset space, they become the kid that couldn't do the math problem. And we're told they're smart and think, well, I'm smart, but I'm not smart enough to do that math problem. These kids think I'm good, but I'm not good enough to win anymore. So now I should stop. And, again, the greatest thing we can teach young athletes, I'm going to say athletes, but it applies to kids in any sphere where they need to develop, is just this concept of putting in the effort is more important than the outcome.
You
know,
said, Tony, you work a lot with leaders. I'd love to hear from you. In your opinion, how has the landscape of leadership changed in the last 2.5 years? And specifically, what does a good leader need to embody today that they didn't need to embody, say, 2.5 pre-pandemic years ago?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I'd say that number one, above anything else, is just letting go of control. I think the one thing that COVID and working from home has forced people to do is to really be outcome driven rather than, I guess, worried so much about how and when people do the work, right? Because people are working from home, and all of a sudden you have to be able to say, do you know what? On a Monday, if you can have this delivered to me by Friday, I'd be happy with that. Do you know what I mean? And then just let the person do it. Just let them do it, and they'll have it delivered on Friday if they're good, and if they're not, then you need to have some sort of conversation about that. So I think this has become more and more important, as we've worked from home. But really, all it's done is it's shone a light on how we should have always managed people, right? And it's forced people into doing it, because now I can't keep an eye on you, 8-10 hours a day. And it was really interesting. I had this conversation with a leader just the other day. I said, who has real trouble letting go. I said, so if you meet with one of your team members on a Monday and say, hey, I'd like you to have this delivered by Friday. I said, if they finish it on Thursday and then take Friday off, is that okay? And this leader said, no, that's not okay. I said, well, why? You said this is what you wanted them to do for the week. He said, I know, but they could have done more. And I said, do you think that they would do more? And he said, well, they should. And I said, okay, well, let me ask you this. If they finished it on Thursday and took Friday off, but just sent it to you Friday afternoon and said they took Friday to do it, would that be okay? And he said, yeah, that'd be all right. I said, like, how crazy does this sound, right? And I think the one thing that what we're finding is, if that person's in the office, right, every day, and I tell them to finish it by Friday, they'll just take till Friday to do it. But if they're at home and they can finish it by Thursday, and be, as long as it's the right quality, right? And then they could have Friday off, then they'll finish it by Thursday afternoon. And the beauty of that is then that they get Friday off, they get a long weekend, they come back on Monday, absolutely ready to put in form, right? Absolutely ready to perform.
Happy.
Instead of just wasting time and hanging around for an extra day, they get another day. And I think one of the things we don't do a good job of is we measure productivity over days and weeks rather than lifetime. And if we measured it over lifetime, we would say 4-day work week is a great idea. Or we'd say, if that person can finish it by Thursday and then take Friday off, and that means over their 10 years they work for me, I'll get a heck of a lot more out of them, then why wouldn't I do that? And I really wish there was some calculator that measured that. But unfortunately, there's not.
Yeah, it's so true. No, some very intriguing points. My next question is around barriers. What are some of the barriers you're seeing to high performance, to leadership, amongst, I guess, some of your clients? What are some of the most common barriers that people experience? And I guess before you answer that, I just want to briefly comment on what I'm seeing with some of my coaching clients. It's around this purpose set piece. I mean, you mentioned legacy earlier on in our conversation. I think the last 2.5 years has really questioned a lot of people to, it's gotten them to question as to whether they're in the right role, whether they're living their purpose, or even what their purpose might be.
Yeah, and I think that's a really, really difficult area in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah.
Because um, I think people can use it one of two ways. So a lot of,
Mhm.
I don't know what you've seen. So a lot of research on purpose that I've seen says that it's not necessarily a thing that you can always go and find. Like it's often a little harder than that, and sometimes it comes from just trying something new that maybe you don't even really like at the start, but you
Sure.
find it a bit challenging, and then you get really good at that,
Mm.
and then you get to this point where you've become so good at it, you become a high performer in it, and then the evolution of that is you become such a high performer that now your next challenge is, how do I share this with people, and how do I help this enrich other people's lives?
Yeah.
And so while some people will be almost born with a purpose or stumble across it or go and identify it, I'd say that more people kind of follow that path where they start on something that they don't realize is their purpose and it becomes their purpose.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
we talk about this leadership continuum of, I start as a learner, then I become a performer,
Mm-hmm.
then I become a leader, and then I become a multiplier, right?
Mm.
And in a way, I think purpose sort of works the same. I learn something new, and then I become good at that, and I become that performer. The leader piece is I find it really fulfilling, and the multiplier piece is I start helping others, and that's where, and that's where it becomes purpose for me.
Yeah.
I think the downside of that, and the downside of this push towards such an importance on finding our purpose,
Mm.
is that sometimes it's stopping people from going through that continuum, because I start something, I don't like it there very much, and I can use purpose as an excuse not to stick with that, right?
Right.
And so there's this kind of fine line, and I'm sure if people don't have the guidance of someone like you to sort of work through that,
Mm.
then they may just go, I don't like this thing, it's not my purpose, I need to move on to another thing.
Yeah.
And the reality is that could become their purpose if they just stuck with a little longer. So I think some people use it as an excuse.
Mm.
But what I do really think, and this goes hand in hand with that great resignation piece, is that people have always been looking for something like that, right?
Yeah.
And whether that's purpose or whether that's just a bigger goal than themselves or something that's more fulfilling, I think people have been looking for that for a long time, and COVID has in some ways given them an opportunity to pursue that.
Yeah.
But I think the leadership challenge is similar, but maybe not as targeted for most leaders, which is just how do I create real clarity for my team about what is most important, right?
Yeah.
How do I create that? How do I create goals that actually inspire people instead of just the standard corporate goals? How do I create a way of working that is really clear and contributes to a great culture for people? How am I so clear about what we're trying to do, but also how that fits with my individual people's goals, which makes it even more clear to them?
Right.
And if we can master that, then all the other stuff I talked about, being hands off, starts to take care of itself. Because on Monday I say, oh, hey, I need you to get this done by the end of the week.
Yeah.
And people are just so clear on what that looks like, and they're so connected to it, and they understand the behaviors that get them there, and maybe the behaviors that get in the way, that they choose all the right behaviors that help them achieve. And in that way, I feel like that's a real parallel between great performers in athletic endeavors and great performers in, corporate life, which is, it's really hard for an athlete to be really, really great at what they do. It's really hard to make the series of right choices over and over and over again to get there.
Yeah.
And I think the same is true for us to really achieve the things that are really important to us in the workplace, whether from a full leadership perspective or just from the person, turning up every day trying to do things that matter.
Yeah.
To make all of those right choices is really hard also.
Yeah.
And it's probably harder in that environment because the distractions aren't so obvious as distractions. The distractions sometimes look like important things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think mastering those choices, and above that, mastering that clarity around what I'm trying to achieve, how I get meaning out of those things, is all probably our biggest challenges.
Yeah, some great points raised there, Tony. I think it comes back to those fundamentals we mentioned previously. We've spoken a little bit about the technology side of things. And just on that front, I wanted to ask you, what does the future hold for you in Performance Lab?
Yeah, it's a great question. My mission is to help people show up every day and do their best work without burning out. Like, that's it, right? In a nutshell. And whether I'm helping leaders create the environment for that, or whether I'm helping staff manage themselves every day. And, when I say do their best work, I don't actually mean just at work, just in personal pursuits and relationships and all of those things. How do we do that? And so my challenge is, as I get older, my challenge becomes just how do I get to more people with that message, right? How do I teach more people those skills? And so from a technology standpoint, is that more online courses? It's wonderful. The great thing that COVID did open up was more virtual stuff, right? Which I can kind of get more people to. So all of those things are really important to me.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, Tony, I'm really, really grateful for you coming on board today. You've offered some amazing insight and some real nuggets there. Just on that last point, how do people get in contact with you and Performance Lab? Is there a website?
Yeah, so easiest one is just performancelab.com.au. Right. From there, you can connect into a whole lot of different things. You can contact us on there, everything.
Amazing. We'll also put a link up to Performance Lab. Now, Tony, before we let you go, we have a fun little segment called the Open Minds Hot Seat.
Okay.
It's very simple, mate. I'm going to put on a timer for 60 seconds. I'm going to fire some very random questions toward you. An opportunity, I guess, also for the listeners to get to know you a little bit better. And then we'll see how we land. How does that sound?
Sounds good. I'm a little nervous, though.
Okay. Sure, you're going to nail it. All right. So let's start now. So, Tony, what's your biggest irrational fear?
My biggest irrational fear? Oh, can I come back to that one? That one's really difficult.
Back to that one. Childhood nickname?
T-Bone, still my nickname today.
Love it. Favorite travel destination?
Island somewhere.
An island somewhere.
Yeah.
Island life. Love it. If you could meet any historical figure or any inspirational or model figure you had as a child, who would that be and why?
Okay, so I would, it's funny because you've already mentioned it, I would sit down with Carol Dweck and Angela Duckworth to talk about growth mindset and grit. I would love to sit down with those two ladies.
Yeah, incredible. What advice would you give your 21-year-old self?
Buy more land at the coast.
Buy more land at the coast. Sunshine or gold?
Either. Doesn't really matter at this point.
Craziest thing you've ever done?
Probably the career change piece, when I was doing really, really well in one career to stop that and move to another. I'd say that's probably up there with, I'm a stability kind of person. So yeah, that was up there for me.
Fantastic. I think you nailed it, mate. That was on just on 60 seconds. I'll give you an opportunity to answer this if you want. Biggest irrational fear?
My biggest irrational fear. You know what?
I'll interrupt you there. I just want to chime in. Mine is cockroaches. I cannot kill a cockroach. I have to get my kids to do it. I have to run away when it comes to cockroaches.
Oh, really? Mine would be more deep-seated than that. It would be like the fear that I'm going to have to live on the streets one day, probably. That is always something that sits in the back of my mind for some reason.
Right. Okay. Well, look, it was a pleasure getting to know you, Tony. And again, mate, I just really want to thank you. I think you're an incredible human being. You're adding so much value to the world. And I'd encourage listeners to look into Tony's work. We'll put the link there to Performance Lab. And again, just very, very grateful and honored to have you on Open Mind. So thank you very much, Tony.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me, mate.
Incredible. Thanks. All the best. And we'll leave it there for Open Minds, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thank you and take care.